Is Babe Ruth calling his shot really that impressive? That's what we're going to be talking about today, right here on Apologetics Underground. If you are any sort of baseball fan, you've heard the story before. It's the 1932 World Series. Game 3, Yankees, Cubs. And who steps up to plate? Babe Ruth, the most famous baseball player of all time, about to make his most famous home run. Supposedly, what happens is that the first couple of pitches don't go Babe's way. And then, out of nowhere, he points to center field. And on the next pitch, smack. Home run, exactly where he pointed. He called his shot. What are the odds of that? I mean, really think about the statistics surrounding that. They're so great, in fact, that plenty of people say didn't happen. They even went as far to interview some of the other players, both on the Yankees side and the Cubs side, during that game. And despite all of the different reports, some of them believing, yep, that's exactly what Babe did. He called his shot and he hit it exactly where he was going, where he called it. To others saying, no, he was just gesturing generally. He wasn't even intending to do that. To others saying, it was a fluke. Still, imagine for a second if that's exactly what Babe did, calling that shot. That's amazing, amazing feat. To be able to predict exactly what is going to happen. This kind of leads us into a discussion of the Bible doing just that. But what if I told you that there are prophecies in the Old Testament that blow calling a shot, a home run, out of the water? So before we get into the actual prophecies themselves, let's set the stage a little bit, shall we? Let's talk about who the prophecies were given to, when they were given, and what they were about. The first one that we're going to talk about here is given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. You might have heard of Abraham before. He's the father of the Jewish people. He's kind of a big deal in the Old Testament. You probably heard that story about him taking Isaac up on the mountain and sacrificing him because God told him to. More on that story in a later video, but just to remind ourselves who this guy is and when he lived. Because we're looking at a character in human history that we believe lived roughly 2,000 years prior to the birth of Jesus Christ. So there's about the same amount of distance in time between Abraham and Jesus as there is between Jesus and us. So we're looking at about 4,000 years ago. The world was a very, very different place. And Abraham, according to the story in Genesis, finds himself in his hometown, the city of Ur. And it's there that God approaches Abraham and has a message for him. Now, we've been calling him Abraham because, well, that's his name, or at least it will be. But here in Genesis 12, where we're going to be reading, his name is actually Abram. That's the name he had before God changed it. And this is where he first really meets God and encounters him. And God shows up to give Abram something. And what is that? It's a promise, but a very special one. A twofold promise, if you will, with two distinct parts to be fulfilled, both parts at a later date. Moses records that promise for us in Genesis 12. Let's read it. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So this promise, as we've already said, has two parts. We call this the twofold promise because of those parts. And those parts are, number one, the nation promise, and number two, the seed promise. The first part of this is a soon-to-be-fulfilled promise. The idea that God is going to take Abraham and his family, and through his offspring, he's going to make him a great nation. This is the fulfillment of Abraham becoming the father of what will be the Jewish people. And it's a couple of hundred years down the line where this will happen. So I know, relatively speaking, that seems like a long time, but the second one is even farther in the distance. Because the second one is the seed promise. And it's this last part of the promise where he says, through you, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. It's rendered another way in another section where he says, through your offspring shall all the nations of the world be blessed. The first part's the nation promise, but this is the seed promise, or we might call it the heir promise. What he's saying is that much later on, through the genetic line of Abraham, God will bless all the nations of the world. Abraham's going to be made into a great nation, but through that nation shall all the nations be blessed. Many biblical scholars consider this to be one of the earliest messianic prophecies. What's a messianic prophecy, you might ask? A prophecy in the Old Testament concerning the coming Messiah, the real main character of the Old Testament. You could go as far to say that the 39 books of the Old Testament are really all about the story of God fulfilling this promise to Abraham that he made to him, as we've already said, 4,000 years ago. This promise is the story of the Old Testament. But this is really kind of where it starts. It certainly doesn't end here. There's much more to be said about this whole coming Messiah.